All right, mathematicians, welcome to Circuit 4. Our first lesson in Circuit 4 is the concept of fractions and decimals. So we're going to be going over a lot of vocabulary today, and you'll want to use this note sheet as you're working through Circuit 4. So we're going to start with this first fraction vocabulary. This is a fraction with the number 3 on top and the number 4 on bottom. We would call this number on top the numerator, and the number on bottom is the denominator. And if you are confused about these, you can check on the vocabulary sheet on Schoology, and it will have an explanation for each of these. Over here we have also a fraction, but it has this whole number in front. This 2 is a whole number. Whenever we have a whole number and a fraction, this whole thing together is called a mixed number. And over here you'll notice our numerator is bigger than our denominator. On most fractions, the numerator is the smaller number, the denominator is bigger. But in this case, our numerator is bigger, our denominator is smaller. This is called an improper fraction. What that means is that it is not, this prefix im means not, so it's not a proper fraction or not a typical fraction. All right, then we're going to come down here and we're going to make some fractions. So it tells us to create the following fractions using these rectangles. So what we're going to think about is this whole rectangle is our whole. And I'm going to use this fraction to divide our whole into parts. So I notice that the denominator shows me 3. That means in my rectangle, I want to have 3 equal parts. I'm going to make it as equal as I can. Try to keep these parts as equal as you can. And then 2/3 of it would be this much. Our next fraction is 5/8. This one's a little easier because I can cut it in half, and then I can cut it in half again until I have 8 equal parts. Okay, so you should have 8 parts. And we're going to shade in 5 of those. The big idea to remember with fractions is that the denominator represents the whole, and the numerator represents how much of that whole we're talking about. All right, we've seen this word a lot, simplify. Simplify means you're going to break it down to the most simple part you can get it. So we're going to simplify the following fractions. To do that with fractions, we divide by a common number, a number that we could divide both of these by. So I see 12 and 16, 12 and 16. And I know that I could divide both 12 and 16 by 4. So I'm going to divide the top by 4 and the bottom by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. 16 divided by 4 is 4. I can't break these down anymore. So this is my final answer, my simplified fraction. The next fraction I see is 25 and 30. So I want to think, what number could I use to divide both 25 and 30? I notice that this ends in a 5 and this ends in a 0. And I remember that any number that ends in a 0, I can divide by 5 as well. So I'm going to divide by 5 here and 5 here. 25 divided by 5 gives me 5. 30 divided by 5 gives me 6. So my simplified fraction is 5/6. Now 14 and 36, I'm not sure right off the top of my head what I can divide both of these by. So I'm going to start small. I notice the 6 is an even number and the 4 is an even number. I'm going to start with 2. And once I do that, I'll be able to break it down more if I'm able. So I see 14 divided by 2. I know that that is 7. 36 divided by 2. If I'm not sure, remember on this circuit we can use our calculator. So I'm going to take 36 divided by 2. And I get 18. So now I want to think about 7 and 18. Do I think there's a number that I could divide both of these by? And I don't think so because of this 7. So this is my simplified fraction. I can move on. The next part asks us to make the following mixed numbers into improper fractions. So if we look back up here, I'm going to be working with fractions like this, numbers like this, and I'm going to be turning them into improper fractions like this. So to do that, I am going to work by multiplying the whole number by the denominator. So that gives me 4 times 3. And then I'm going to add the numerator. So 4 times 3 gives me 12 plus 2. So my top number is 14. My denominator stays the same. So my answer is 14/3. All right, now over here I have -2 and 3/7. Remember when working with fractions that this negative always just kind of hangs out in the front. It's not necessarily attached to any one number, okay? So I'm going to ignore it for a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do 2 times 7 plus 3, and I get 17. And I'm going to carry down my denominator, same denominator to the bottom. And then I'm going to put that negative sign right out front. Now we're doing kind of the opposite here. We're going to make these improper fractions into mixed numbers. We're going to use a similar idea, but instead of multiplying, we're going to be dividing. So I see that I have 14 over 5, 14/5. So I want to start by dividing 14 by 5. And I want to think, how many times can 5 go into 14? So I'm going to use my calculator. Remember, you can be using Desmos as well. So I am going to take 14. Oops. Sorry. I'm going to take 14 divided by 5, and I get 2 8/10. I don't want that decimal, that 8/10. So I'm going to start with that whole number. I know 2. And then what I need to do is I need to find out what my numerator would be. My denominator will stay 5. But in order to do that, if I got 2 8/10, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply 2. So if I get 2 times, 5 will go into 14 2 times. 2 times 5, I get 10. I'm going to subtract these. My remainder is 4. That becomes my new numerator. Let's try that one more time. So again, I'm going to ignore this negative for a little bit. I've got 26/3. So I'm going to start by taking 26 divided by 3. And I get a decimal again. So I have 8, but then I have that decimal. So I'm going to take 8 times 3, gives me 24. I'm going to subtract. I have 2 left over. So 8 becomes my whole number. 2 is my numerator. 3 is my denominator. And I still have that negative. So I'm just going to attach that to the front. All right, so this is going to be kind of important for you to keep to remind us about fractions. Turn your paper over, and on the back side, you'll notice we're talking about decimals. So this is for you to use while we're working with decimals in this circuit. Keep track of this because you might want to look back at it. And let's look at some of our ways we say a decimal. It says, how would you say the following numbers? So a lot of people would say 3.1, but we really want to know, what is that 0.1? What does that really stand for? So we're going to use this to help us. So here's my decimal, and here's my decimal in my number. Before that, I could place this number, and I would put the 3 here and the 1 here. So I would say this as 3 and that 1 would be here. So that would be 1/10. Okay, your decimal is always this word and. That's where your decimal belongs. So now this one is a little longer, so we're definitely going to want to use this as we write it out. So I notice -2, so I'm going to start with that. And then my decimal is going to be and. Now I want to think, where would I place these numbers? So I would put 5, 8, 3 here. So when I write this out, I'm going to be using this thousands word. So it would be 583 thousandths. All right, let's look at the next part. We're gonna write these as numbers. So here I have the sentence, I'm gonna write it as numbers. So this is 4 and 13,000. So I wanna know this and represents my decimal. So before that, I have 4, then I have 13,000. So let's look up here. If I know I'm gonna end in the thousands place, that's where my 3 from 13 would go. And then I'd have my 1 here in the hundredths place. And to fill in this gap, I'm gonna put a 0. So my number would look like this. This one I would read as 760 and 1200. So I know this and is my decimal. So this is where my decimal is going to be. I can start here with 763. So 700, I would start here. So it would be 763 and 1200. So I know it's going to end in this hundredths place. So I'm going to do 12. This kind of looks like a multiply sign, so I'm going to move that down a little bit. All right, our last thing today is that we're going to be plotting these numbers, these decimals, on a number line. So I'm going to start my number line at 0. Okay, and then I'm going to look at these, and I'm noticing that not many of these are negative. I've got 2 negatives, 3 positives, and I also see that these are decimals. So each of these have a decimal, which means they're not going to fall exactly on my line. So let's start with this 0 and 3/10. It's not quite 1. It's a little bit bigger than 0, but not quite to 1 yet. So that's going to go about right here. Then I have 1 and 9/10. I know that 9 is going to be really, really close to that too, almost right next to it. Because if I divided this up into 9 or into 10 spaces, my 9 would be right next to this 2. So this will be 1 and 9/10. My next number is 2 and 5/10. So I know it's at least 2. It's not quite to 3. Where would 5 fall if I were thinking this were 10 spaces in here? Well, 5 would be kind of right in the middle. So this one will be my 2 and 5/10. Then I have my 2 negatives. So this is -10th. So it's not to 1 yet. It's way over here, almost next to that 0. And then I have -2 and 7/10. So I know it's more than 2 because I said and. So -2 and 7/10. So if this were 10 spaces, I would want to think about where would 7 be, and I think probably right here. Okay, so that's our big idea going into using fractions and decimals in Circuit 4.